have an extremely distinguished panel of, beginning with my left, Dr. Henry Barkey, Henry, sorry, Dr. Metin Heper to my right, and on the far right, Dr. Ergun Özbudun. I'm going to ask Dr. Ergun Özbudun to begin and talk particularly about the constitutional reforms that are before that Turkey is now working on. Dr. Özbudun, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can hear me. When a couple of hours ago, our dear moderator told me that our 15 minutes talking time was cut short to 10 minutes, I experienced a slight shock because I was supposed to handle the Turkish constitutional problem, and to do it within 10 to 12 minutes would be a mission impossible. But rules are rules, and I'll obey by the rules. I assure you that Turkish domestic politics is no less exciting than Turkish foreign relations, questions with Armenia or Russia or Iran or Israel. Actually, we have been fighting over the constitutional problems for over 30 years. And in the last 3 years in a more acute form, so I'll concentrate mostly on the last 3 years, the more acute period of Turkish constitutional crisis, if you will. However, anybody who is even slightly familiar with Turkey would admit that Turkey has a constitutional problem. And again, a more or less universal agreement is on the point that the roots of the problem goes back to the 1982 Constitution and the military regime that prepared and adopted that Constitution. Again, a clear fact is that the 1982 Constitution was prepared in the most unrepresentative and undemocratic way imaginable. Actually, in essence, by the will of the 5 generals who staged the coup with the help of a totally appointed so-called consultative assembly. And then it was adopted by a referendum whose democratic legitimacy is extremely dubious. Therefore, expectedly, the Constitution reflected the authoritarian and titularist mentality of its military founders. So far, there is no disagreement. The right and the left and the middle, all Turkish observers within the country and outside Turkey agree on this point. Then, with the transition to a civilian regime in 1983, a process of constitutional change has begun, and starting from 87, the Constitution has been amended 15 times, or 16 if you exclude the one that was annulled by the Constitutional Court in 2008. And now there is another one before the Constitutional Court. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. The net result of those 15 amendments is, of course, a certain degree of normalization, liberalization, and civilization in the Turkish political system. Some amendments were more radical than the others. Some dealt with only a single article or a couple of articles. Some amended a greater number of articles. However, at the end of the day, again, a general agreement is that all those 15 amendments have not been able to liquidate fully the authoritarian legacy of the military regime of 1980 to 1983. The problem is essentially a problem of a tutelary conception of government. It was very clear from the statements of the military rulers of that period that they had very little confidence in civilian politics, civilian political parties and leaders. Therefore, they designed a system in which the area for civilian politics would be as narrow as possible, and some sort of tutelary control would be exercised over the activities of governments, elected governments. An important tutelary mechanism was the National Security Council, in which the military was represented at the highest level. And secondly, the system of the high courts, the judicial system, was designed in such a way as to function as an important break on the activities of the elected bodies of the government. This last point should not be confused with a very respectable concept of Western democracy, a system of checks and balances. Of course, democracy cannot be equated with absolute majority rule. In every democracy that deserves to be called that way, you need certain institutional checks and balances. Of course, an independent judiciary is one of them. In many countries, in not all Western democracies, but in most of them, a constitutional system of justice has also been introduced to check the constitutionality of laws. However, those concepts in Turkey have been diverted from their original meanings that they have in Western democracies, and under our tutelary conception, the judiciary is conceived as the last and ultimate arbiter of the system, which is not the case in Western democracies. And again, I am talking about a highly politicized judiciary, which can be observed in all branches of the judiciary, the general courts, the system of administrative courts, the constitutional court, the High Council of Judges and Public Prosecutors. And nowadays, there seems to be a serious conflict between such a politicized judiciary, which still tries to maintain a tutelist system over civilian politics, and the elected branches of the government, which is at the moment represented by the Justice and Development Party, the AKP. As I said, our constitutional problem entered into a phase of acute constitutional crisis in 2007 over the election of a new president of the Republic. At that time, the president was supposed to be chosen by the Grand National Assembly, and the provision of the article 102 at that time had foreseen 4 rounds of elections. In the first 2 rounds, a 2/3 majority of the full membership was required, and in the third and fourth rounds, an absolute majority of the full membership.